Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm watching Is the World Getting More Violent by Kurzgesagt. I'm assuming this video came out because of the Ukrainian war, the fact that the Syrian civil war is started to heat up again and Assad has just been ousted from Syria now and the rebels took control, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, the answer to this question is no. The world is not getting more violent. It has always been like this. It's just that for some reason people are only now starting to pay more attention to these conflicts. I mean, the Ukrainian conflict started in 2014, it's just that it's heated up more in 2022 when Russia did a full-scale invasion. Syria started back in, I think, 2011, and then after a while it kind of went on pause for a bit, and now it's started back up again. These aren't new things, this is just a continuation of conflicts that have been going on for a very long time. But anyway, let's watch it. Link to the original video will be down in the description below.
10 years ago in 2014, we asked if war was over. Based on long-term trends in the last century, it seemed violent conflict was on the decline and the world more peaceful than ever. Our video
that's just a lie.
With the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war between Hamas and Israel. And, well, a decade later, we could start this video exactly the same way. But is the world
it's just
as
the
a
same
whole
stuff.
more violent today?
Nothing has changed.
In a nutshell, we made 7 claims in 2014. 1. We have less conflict deaths than ever. 2.
That is still true, I
no
think.
more wars between countries.
Well,
3.
that's not true.
Democracies don't fight each other.
That's not
4.
true at all.
Borders are mostly fixed. 5. Most conflicts are in
kind of
areas that were under foreign control either by colonial states or Soviet dictatorships. 6.
Pretty
more
true.
civil wars are ending by diplomacy. 7.
No,
we're in the most peaceful
I don't think
period
so.
of history. So
the
let's
last
see how
one's
our
true,
video
though.
has held up. First, let's get an overview of conflicts in the last decade. Some of the deadliest
Definitely
conflicts
a
that
lot
were
less.
glowing hot in 2014 have since ended or significantly cooled down. The war in Afghanistan ended with the victory of the Taliban. While the civil wars in Yemen and Libya are all still ongoing, they turned mostly into stalemates. The proto-state of ISIS in Iraq and Syria has been wiped out. And breaking news.
Well, there's a chance they might make a comeback now due to the instability in the region, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
The rebels just won the war in Syria last week. The extremely destructive civil war in South Sudan ended in a fragile peace agreement despite violence still flaring up in the devastated young country. Sadly, the last decade saw a bunch of new conflicts erupt, or old unresolved issues turn violent.
That's just how humanity works.
One of our video 10 years ago was that wars today are not between countries, and this is still largely true. Civil wars are by far the most common type of state-based conflict in the world. We'd wager that most of you have never heard about one of the deadliest civil wars in decades,
I think it was half
the
a million?
2020 Tigray War in Ethiopia. It ended in 2022 with the victory of the Ethiopian and Eritrean government forces against rebel groups. Exact death tolls are unknown, but they may exceed 500,000, mostly civilians.
Oh, it may exceed 500,000.
Aside from Tigray, a number of new civil wars have broken out since 2014. Although new is a bit misleading since the underlying issues were brooding at a smaller scale for a long time. The
Nothing is
deadliest have been the
truly
Sudan
new.
civil war, the civil war in Yemen, and the civil war in Myanmar. Multiple nations in Africa like Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, Burkina Faso and Mozambique are suffering from Islamist insurgencies that destabilize countries and have cost tens of thousands of civilian lives. Lastly, there are nearly 60 smaller unresolved state-based conflicts around the world, many going on for decades, that are smouldering but have a relatively low death toll in comparison. Maybe the worst news is that we've been seeing interstate wars again.
Russia and
There
Ukraine.
was the short-lived 2020 war
And
between
Azerbaijan,
and Armenia, which redrew contested borders. Then there's the latest war between Israel and Hamas that turned into a regional crisis.
That's been going on for a long
What
time.
is certainly the most disturbing new development is the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It's
Which
the
was pretty
first
much a complete
large-scale
failure.
interstate war in 20 years.
For Russia.
And the first war since World War II where a major power is trying to conquer territory and to subjugate another state. It followed
it's
an
not
8-year
doing too
conflict
well.
that started with the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. Exact casualty rates for the war since 2022 are hard to verify, but they go as high as hundreds of thousands.
I wonder what exactly Kultgesagt means by casualties, because a casualty doesn't necessarily mean death. It could just be injury that takes someone out of combat. If they're talking about deaths, it's definitely not 1 million yet. If we're talking about both deaths and casualties, it's probably crossed 1 million by this point. Also depends if we're counting both soldiers and civilians or if we count them separately.
Hard to verify, but they go as high as hundreds of thousands. Okay, so what about our 2014 claims? If we add up the numbers, we see a few things. Roughly between 2004 and 2014, there were about 350,000 deaths from state-based conflicts worldwide. They were going down from 2014 to 2019 and then rose sharply in 2021. In total, from 2014 to 2024, we saw about 1.2 million deaths. If we include all violent conflicts like the Mexican drug war, the number rises to 1.5 million, 3 times higher than the previous decade.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a massive amount of people who die, mostly for nothing, but comparing it to the world population, 1.5 million, that's nothing, that's a laughable amount. It makes no difference.
2022 had the highest death toll from violent conflict since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The Tigray War and the war in Ukraine alone were responsible for the majority of lives lost, as both wars involved armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sometimes thrown against entrenched positions in human wave attacks. So, the last 3 years have been unusually violent. But if we zoom out a bit more, we can put those numbers into perspective. A terrible thing, but nowhere near how bad it can get when the world goes to war. In the grand scheme of things, we are still living in relatively peaceful times.
I've already seen people fear-mongering about how the conflict in Syria will cause World War III. Like, Jesus, just stop. Well, it's going to change some stuff, but it's not going to cause World War III.
Reverse, or if the last few years were an anomaly.
If Ukraine didn't cause World War III, then Syria definitely won't.
Wars between states again, so our prediction on wars between countries didn't hold up. What is as true today as in 2014 is that almost all armed conflicts in the world are in countries that were under foreign occupation in the 20th century, either by colonialism or by the expansive Soviet dictatorship. Ethnic groups were split apart or forced together by arbitrary borders, resources unequally distributed, or power vacuums created, which led to conflicts that are in many cases still unresolved.
Topple the statue, just like they did with Assad in Syria.
There have also been no wars between democracies who seem uniquely unwilling to fight each other. So compared to the last century, it's still true that war between nations is...
Yeah, you can't really call the war between Ukraine and Russia a war between democracies, because Russia is not a democracy. I don't know enough about Ukrainian politics to say if it's a real democracy or not, but Russia definitely isn't.
Still an exception rather than the rule. On the other hand, we see fewer civil wars end by diplomacy. Instead, there's an increase in either victories or stalemates.
Yeah,
these often
diplomacy doesn't work.
Resolutions to the conflict, only pauses in the fighting, because
a perfect example of that is Russia and Ukraine right now. Diplomacy trying to talk with Russia does not work. And it was the same with Hitler during and before World War II. Diplomacy didn't work. You had to fight and one side had to lose. Plain and simple. No such thing as talking.
Underlying causes haven't been solved.
There's some wars that diplomacy cannot solve.
We can see that most international borders in the world still hold up.
You just have to fight it out and wipe out one of the two sides.
There are still a few dozen territorial disputes in the world, most of them in Africa and Asia. And some are getting hotter, like the border clash between India and China over Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. China's claim to Taiwan, or Venezuela threatening to annex part of Guyana's oil-rich province Essequibo. One thing that makes wars so deadly is that they're often supported by external powers. Many countries are providing support or arming up different sides or factions, like the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran for hegemony, with Iran being the main supporter for the Houthis, Hezbollah or Hamas.
You know, the three terrorist organizations which are being funded by Iran, because that's what Iran does. They fund terrorist organizations.
Or in the Ukrainian war, with the
West
supporting Ukraine, while China, Iran and North Korea support Russia. But it's not just countries. External powers keeping conflicts alive can also be Islamist groups like ISIS or criminal networks. or even local elites that benefit from their own country being torn apart and effectively prevent conflicts from ending. The end of the rules-based world? There's a lot of debate among experts about what factors make the world more or less peaceful, but there are no easy answers. One of the major reasons the world has seen less conflict was that after the end of the Cold War, many countries expected a sort of rules-based world order, and for a time this worked somewhat. But things have been changing in the last few years. The world has become multipolar, with new alliances forming, and the idea of a rules-based world is being challenged. China's manufacturing capacity is now as big as the US and Europe's combined. With its massive economic development, a new superpower has risen. It's common knowledge that the US spends more on its military than any place in the world, but this may no longer reflect the true balance of power. China doesn't report all of its military spending like the US does, and it gets a lot more done with each equivalent dollar spent. Recent estimates trying to account for these differences tell us China's effective military budget is now a significant portion of the United States' budget. And with Russia breaking the taboo of launching the first war of conquest by a major power in almost 80 years, Europe has begun the process of rearming. It is slow because, well, Europe is slow, but it is happening. We're in the transition to a multipolar world again, with different nations and alliances claiming spheres of power they want to dominate. In this climate, tensions and conflicts between states have been rising, even if most of them have not turned into wars yet. So, is war over? The clear answer is no. And the direction we're headed in doesn't seem great. But with all the gloom, it's also true that we are still in a peaceful period of world history, and that deaths by war are still at historic lows. The world is at a crossroads. We'll do another update video in 2034. Let's all hope we'll have better news for you then.
In 10 years, yeah. With how quick things are changing, you'll have to make an update video in like 2 or 3 years. Yeah, war will never end. War is simply a part of the human species, as well as any other living being on Earth. War always has and always will be a part of humanity. That will not change. Humans will always find a reason to fight each other. That's a simple fact of life. Like it or not, it's how it is. We still live in far better times than we used to. As for China's military development, I wouldn't really say it's that big of a problem. I mean, most of their equipment is just a cheap copy of US equipment, and it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. I mean, just look at them. You can tell it's a cheap copy. The United States still holds superiority over China when it comes to the military. That probably won't change for the next 20 to 30 years, so nothing to worry about. China also probably won't invade Taiwan because that would almost definitely cause a conflict, a military conflict between the US and China, and China will not come out a winner in that. Neither will the US, but China just wouldn't go for that. It wouldn't make sense. Any conflict between the US and China, like an actual war, is just going to end terribly for both parties. So they're most likely, it's going to be another Cold War, like with the US and the USSR. It's just going to be the same thing. But most likely nothing is going to come out of it. There's probably going to be a bunch of proxy wars in different countries, smaller ones, where one side is supported by the US, the other by China. You know, same thing as with the USSR. At least that's what I think is going to happen. That's just my opinion. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you're interested, why not watch this video right here? And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.